The taste of sand filled my mouth as I woke up. Not the pleasant kind you might accidentally get at the beach. This was different. Coarse, metallic, invasive. It coated my tongue, my teeth, the back of my throat. I couldn't remember falling asleep, but I definitely wasn't where I should have been. My eyes burned as I forced them open. The sun's glare hit me like a physical blow. Above me stretched an endless blue sky. No clouds, no mercy. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt disconnected from my brain, moving with agonizing slowness. Where was everyone? Where was the jeep? I patted my pockets, desperately searching for my phone. Nothing. My backpack was gone too. All I had were the clothes on my back, a now filthy white t-shirt, khaki shorts that offered little protection, and a pair of once expensive sneakers that Mom had insisted would be perfect for your gap year adventure. Some adventure this was turning out to be. Have you ever been truly alone? Not the kind of alone where you're in your room while your family's downstairs. I mean the kind where you turn in a complete circle and see nothing but endless horizon in every direction. Where your voice, when you finally find the courage to shout, "Hello?" seems to be swallowed by the vastness before it even leaves your mouth. That was my reality as I stood on shaking legs in the middle of the Sahara desert with no water, no shelter, and absolutely no idea which direction might lead to salvation. 48 hours earlier, I'd been having the time of my life. After graduating high school, I'd convinced my parents to let me take a gap year before college. It'll make my application stand out, I'd argued. Though really, I just wanted to escape the pressure of deciding what to do with my life. North Africa wasn't originally on my itinerary. But when I met Pascal and Emily at a hostel in Spain, their plans to cross into Morocco sounded too exciting to pass up. They were experienced travelers. At least they seemed that way to my 18-year-old self. Pascal had a weathered look about him, with sun-bleached hair and the kind of tan you only get from months outdoors. Emily spoke 4 languages and knew how to haggle in markets like she'd been born doing it. "You must come with us, Alex," Pascal had insisted, his French accent making everything sound sophisticated. "We've hired a guide to take us into the desert. Very authentic, very special. Not the tourist trap routes." I should have been suspicious when our experienced guide, Mohammed, showed up in Marrakesh with a jeep that had definitely seen better days. The cracked dashboard was held together with duct tape, and the seatbelts were more decorative than functional. But Mohammed's easy smile and confident manner had put me at ease. 3 days in desert, then back to city, he'd promised. You see real Sahara, real stars, no other tourists. That last part turned out to be painfully true. Our first day had actually been magical. We'd driven far from civilization, the landscape gradually transforming from scrubby, semi-arid plains to the rolling dunes I'd always imagined when thinking of deserts. Mohammed had set up camp as the sun set, efficiently erecting a small tent and building a fire where he prepared a fragrant tagine dinner. "Tomorrow we visit my cousin's camp," he'd told us as we sat under stars so bright they seemed artificial. He is Tuareg, desert people, many generations in Sahara. I remember feeling a thrill at this. The Tuareg were the famous blue men of the desert, known for their indigo clothing and nomadic lifestyle. This was exactly the kind of authentic experience I'd hoped for. That night, I'd slept better than I had in weeks, lulled by the profound silence of the desert. The next morning is where my memory gets fuzzy. I remember packing up camp, climbing back into the jeep. I remember a disagreement between Pascal and Mohammed about which route to take. Pascal, always trying to assert his worldliness, insisted we should head deeper into the Dune Sea. "The real experience," he'd said, tapping at a map spread across his knees. Mohammed had looked unsure. Not safe. Too far from water. But Pascal had been insistent, and Emily had backed him up. I'd stayed quiet. Who was I to question their travel wisdom? There had been a tea break somewhere along the way. Sweet mint tea poured ceremoniously from a height into small glasses. I'd felt strange afterward. Dizzy, disoriented. At the time, I blamed it on the heat. The last clear memory I had was of Mohammed and Pascal arguing again. Their voices raised against the backdrop of the engine's strain as we'd climbed a particularly steep dune. Then, nothing. Until I woke up alone, with sand in my mouth and the desert stretching endlessly around me. Had there been an accident? Had I wandered away in a heat-induced delirium? Had they left me behind intentionally? None of these questions would help me now. The brutal reality was simpler. I was alone in one of the world's most inhospitable environments, with no supplies and no clear way out. The sun was still rising, which meant I had maybe an hour before the full heat of the day descended. I needed to think clearly, to remember anything useful. My mind flashed to a survival show I'd binge-watched last winter. What had the rugged host said about deserts? First rule, find water. Second rule, find shelter from the sun. Third rule, signal for help. Water seemed like an impossible dream in this landscape. I had nothing to carry it in anyway. Shelter was the immediate priority. I studied my surroundings more carefully. I was in a slight depression between dunes, and about 50 yards away, I could see what looked like darker sand and a few scraggly bushes. Vegetation meant the potential for slightly damper ground, maybe even some shade. Walking on sand is exhausting in the best circumstances. In my weakened state, those 50 yards felt like a marathon. My sneakers kept sinking, forcing me to expend precious energy with each step. By the time I reached the bushes, my shirt was soaked with sweat, moisture I couldn't afford to lose. The bushes were pathetic things, barely knee-high with thin branches and tiny leaves. But they were growing from the lee side of a slight ridge, and their presence suggested this area might be slightly more hospitable than the open dunes. I dropped to my knees and began digging with my hands. The surface sand was hot, but a few inches down, it felt noticeably cooler. One of the few desert survival facts I knew was that you could sometimes find water by digging in low areas where plants grew. After 10 minutes of frantic digging, my fingernails caked with sand and skin raw. I hadn't found moisture, but I had created a small hollow under the largest bush. It wasn't much, but it would provide some shade. I crawled in, curling my body to fit the inadequate space. The temperature difference between sun and shade must have been at least 15 degrees Celsius. As I lay there, forcing myself to breathe slowly to conserve energy and moisture, the reality of my situation truly hit me. No one knew where I was. I didn't even know where I was. The odds of someone randomly coming across me in this vast emptiness were virtually zero. I might die here. The thought sent a surge of panic through me, and I had to fight the urge to jump up and start running in some random direction that would only hasten my end. "Think, Alex," I whispered, my voice sounding strange in the silence. What would the Tuareg do? It was a random thought, but it triggered something. Mohammed had mentioned his Tuareg cousin. He'd said something during our drive about how the desert nomads could travel for days without water by knowing how to conserve their body's moisture. I couldn't create water from nothing, but I could minimize what I was losing. I removed my t-shirt and draped it over my head and shoulders, creating a makeshift covering that allowed air to circulate while keeping the sun off my skin. I breathed through my nose, not my mouth, to reduce moisture loss from respiration. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Even in my shaded hollow, sweat trickled down my temples and back. I knew I needed to stay still, to wait out the worst of the day's heat. But my mind raced with desperate calculations. How far had we driven from civilization? 2 hours? 3? More? Even if I knew which direction to walk, a person in good condition with water might cover 25 miles in a day on flat ground. In soft sand, dehydrated and weakened, I'd be lucky to make 5 miles before collapsing. No, my only real hope was to be found. Someone would report us missing eventually. When was our jeep due back in Marrakesh? I couldn't remember the exact return date Mohammed had planned. The afternoon wore on. The heat became a living thing, pressing down on me with physical weight. My thoughts grew fuzzy around the edges. I drifted in and out of a restless sleep, plagued by dreams of ice-cold waterfalls and air-conditioned rooms. I woke fully as the light began to change, the harsh white of midday shifting to a warmer gold. The sun was finally descending. With it, the temperature would drop, potentially to dangerous lows during the night. The desert's extreme temperature fluctuations were another deadly aspect of this environment. I crawled out from my shelter, muscles protesting after hours in the same position. Standing made me dizzy, black spots dancing at the edges of my vision. I hadn't had water since... when? The tea yesterday, even longer. I needed to find a better position before night fell. Higher ground would help me spot lights from vehicles or settlements, if any existed within view. The largest nearby dune rose perhaps 100 feet above my position. Climbing it was torturous. 2 steps up and sliding 1 step back, my calves burning with the effort. But reaching the crest rewarded me with a view that simultaneously inspired hope and despair. The desert spread out around me in breathtaking beauty, dunes creating flowing patterns of light and shadow in the setting sun. In the far distance to the west, at least I assumed it was west, given the sun's position, I could see the darker silhouette of what might be mountains or might be a mirage. But what caught my attention was a series of parallel tracks in the sand, perhaps half a mile to the south. Vehicle tracks, still visible despite the constantly shifting nature of the dunes. If those were from our jeep, following them might lead me back to civilization, or at least to the route Mohammed had planned to take. Or they could belong to completely different vehicles, potentially heading deeper into the desert. With night approaching, I had to make a choice. Try to reach the tracks before darkness made navigation impossible, or stay put and hope for rescue. I chose movement. Staying in one place felt too much like waiting to die. The twilight was brief, as it often is in desert regions. One moment I was hurrying across the sand with the red glow of sunset guiding me. The next, I was plunged into a darkness so complete it felt like blindness. I'd never seen stars like this. Thousands upon thousands, so bright and clear they cast faint shadows. Under different circumstances, it would have been awe-inspiring. Now, it only emphasized how small and insignificant I was beneath the vast cosmic indifference. The temperature plummeted with shocking speed. My sweat-dampened clothes, which had offered some cooling relief during the day, now became an icy liability as the moisture evaporated in the dry air. My teeth began to chatter, and I wrapped my arms around myself, wishing desperately for the emergency blanket that had been in my missing backpack. I'd reached the tracks just as the light failed completely, but now I had no way of following them in the darkness. I huddled beside them, wondering if I should try to dig another shelter. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound carrying it through the still night air. At first, I thought it was my imagination or the blood pulsing in my ears. But as I focused, the sound became clearer. It was a drum, distant but distinct. People. There were people somewhere near enough that their sound carried to me. I staggered to my feet, straining my eyes against the darkness. Far in the distance, perhaps a couple of miles away, I saw it. The faintest orange glow of what could only be a fire. New energy surged through me. I began walking toward that distant light, using the stars as my guide. The cold was still intense, but the prospect of human contact, of water and warmth, drove me forward despite my exhaustion. The ground changed as I walked, becoming firmer. The massive dunes gave way to smaller, more stable formations. Occasionally, my foot would catch on something. A rock, a root, even what felt like old animal bones. I stumbled often, but kept moving, afraid that if I stopped to rest, I might never get up again. The drumming grew louder, occasionally accompanied by what sounded like singing or chanting. The fire glow separated into multiple points of light. A camp, perhaps, or a small settlement. After what seemed like hours of walking, I crested a small rise and saw them. A cluster of low tents arranged in a rough circle around several fires. Dark figures moved between them, their shadows elongated by the firelight. Relief made my knees buckle. I tried to call out, but my parched throat produced only a raspy whisper. I forced myself to keep moving, half walking, half stumbling down the gentle slope toward the camp. I was maybe 100 yards away when a dog barked sharply. A figure detached from the group, moving in my direction with the purposeful stride of someone investigating a potential threat. I raised my hands instinctively to show I was unarmed, a universal gesture of peace. The figure, a man I could now see, hesitated, then called out something in a language I didn't understand. "Help," I managed to croak. "Please help." More figures appeared behind the first, including one holding an old-fashioned oil lamp that cast their faces in flickering light. I caught glimpses of dark skin, indigo blue fabric, and expressions of surprise. "American," I said, tapping my chest. "Lost. No water." Understanding crossed their faces. Two men stepped forward, grasping my arms and supporting me as my legs finally gave out completely. They half carried me into their camp, voices rising around us in a language that flowed like water. They brought me to the largest fire and sat me down on a woven mat. An elderly woman approached with a small clay cup. I reached for it desperately, but a young man who seemed to have some authority held up his hand. "Slow," he said in heavily accented English. "Very slow drink." I knew he was right. Drinking too quickly after severe dehydration can be dangerous. With trembling hands, I took the cup and sipped the water. The most exquisite thing I had ever tasted. The camp around me was unlike anything I'd imagined. These weren't tourist accommodations, but the real dwellings of desert nomads. The tents were low structures of dark material stretched over frames, their sides rolled up to allow air circulation. Intricate carpets covered the sand, and cooking pots hung over carefully managed fires. As I sipped the water, the young man who had spoken English sat across from me. He wore the traditional indigo head covering of the Tuareg, wrapped so that only his eyes were visible. "How you come here?" he asked. "No tourists, this place." Through painful sips and raspy words, I explained about Mohammed, Pascal, and Emily, our journey into the desert, and waking up alone. As I spoke, the man's eyes narrowed. "This Mohammed," he said slowly. "What name is family?" I shook my head. "I don't know. He said his cousin was Tuareg." The man exchanged rapid words with an older man sitting nearby. The conversation seemed heated. "We know no guide named Mohammed with Tuareg cousin," he finally said. "I think bad people," They take tourists sometimes. For money, for... He hesitated, apparently searching for a diplomatic way to explain. For bad things. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Had I been the victim of a scam? Or worse, an abduction attempt gone wrong? Why leave me in desert? I asked. The young man shrugged. Maybe you sick, too much trouble. Maybe they afraid when you not wake up from sleeping medicine. Many reasons for bad people to do bad things. Sleeping medicine. The strange dizziness after the tea suddenly made sense. How did I survive? I asked, the reality of my miraculous escape beginning to sink in. Allah willed it, the old man said simply, speaking English for the first time. And you found Kel Tamashek. The young man translated. We are the Tuareg. The real Tuareg, not the cousin of fake guides. That night, wrapped in warm blankets and with a small portion of stew in my stomach, I slept deeply despite the lingering fear and confusion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. How to contact the authorities, how to get back to civilization, how to deal with the trauma of what had happened. But I was alive, thanks to luck or divine intervention, or both. And I had found not the tourist version of desert nomads that Pascal had promised, but the genuine article. A people who had survived in this harsh environment for countless generations, and who had extended that survival knowledge to a lost teenager who had absolutely no business being alive. In the days that followed, they taught me their ancient ways. Ibrahim, the young English-speaking man, became my teacher. He showed me how certain plants indicated water below the surface, how to recognize a wadi that might hold moisture beneath the sand. He taught me to create shelter using minimal materials, to position myself to maximize shade while allowing air movement. Sun is enemy and friend, he told me. Kills by day, guides by night. I learned how to walk on sand to conserve energy, to cover my skin not just for protection from the sun, but to prevent moisture loss. At night, Ibrahim's grandfather Musa taught me to read the stars for navigation. When it was time for the nomads to move camp, they took me with them. I experienced the rhythmic swaying of camel travel, the efficient routine of setting up and breaking down their portable homes. I watched in awe as children barely older than toddlers helped with tasks that seemed impossibly adult. Tending animals, preparing food, finding resources in what looked to me like emptiness. 3 days later, we reached a place called Tinabao, a gathering of wells where multiple nomadic groups converged to trade goods and information. There, I met a trader who regularly traveled to the nearest town with a telephone. The night before I was to leave with him, Musa sat with me by the fire. Through Ibrahim's translation, he asked what I would do when I returned to the world of phones and buildings. Report what happened to the authorities, I said. Those people who abandoned me might do the same to others. He nodded gravely. And then, the question gave me pause. Before this experience, my gap year had been about seeing places, having adventures, postponing decisions about my future. Now, I want to learn more about traditional knowledge, I said slowly. Not just survival skills, but how people like the Tuareg understand the world. There's so much wisdom that's being lost. A rare smile spread across Musa's weathered face. He spoke at length, gesturing occasionally toward the stars. My grandfather says, Ibrahim translated, that knowledge is like water in the desert. Some see only dry sand and think nothing is there. But those who know where to look find that water has always been present beneath the surface. He says you have eyes that can learn to see what is hidden. Musa pressed a small pendant into my palm, a blue-green stone wrapped in silver wire on a leather cord. Tuareg protection, Ibrahim explained. Reminder that beauty and value exist where others see nothing. The next morning, I left with the trader in his ancient pickup truck, bumping across the desert towards civilization. As we drove, I fingered the pendant, thinking about what Musa had said about not surviving alone, about seeing value where others see nothing. When we finally reached the town, the local police contacted the American consulate. Within days, I was back in the modern world of air conditioning, cell phones, and constant connectivity. But the desert had changed me. I no longer saw empty spaces as empty. I no longer perceived stillness as the absence of activity. I had learned that survival isn't about heroic individual effort, but about knowledge passed down through generations and community support when it matters most. I returned to America with stories that few would fully understand. But I also returned with a clarity I had lacked before, about what I wanted to study, about the kind of work I hoped to do, about the values that would guide my choices. The scammers who had abandoned me in the desert had meant it as my end. Instead, it became my beginning. They couldn't have known that by leaving me to die, they would actually introduce me to the very people who would not only save my life, but transform it. Is there a more fitting revenge than that?